It's a very warm welcome to the Cricket Library podcast. Dr. John Orchard, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really pleased to be involved and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time for you. You've got a book that's about to be published, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But where I like to always start with my guests is your passion for cricket. What are your earliest memories of either playing or loving cricket as a youngster?
Yeah, look, I would say it's mainly derived from being a fan. I was never a really good cricketer. I was a kid who was pretty small. I come from a sporting family, so my dad was an Olympian in water polo, and he never played much cricket. But it's just part of the culture of where you grow up. So I grew up in Melbourne, and so my footy background is AFL, but because I've lived in Sydney for so many years, I follow all the footy codes. And my summer was everyone plays cricket, and I'm fascinated now with having my own kids that cricket doesn't have that same hold on summer sport in terms of the kids playing it. So there's probably more kids playing basketball at school as their chosen sport, but pretty much everyone played cricket at school growing up, in the yard, and that was the chosen sport the kids played on the weekend if they played a weekend sport too. So cricket was not a sport that I loved on the basis of being a gun cricketer myself, and I was anything but. I don't think I ever played in the A's at school, but I was just a fan, and I suppose I'm a geek, and cricket is the Australian geek sport, if that makes sense. Like it's sort of, and they say that about baseball in the US, that it's sort of like it's the geek sport, so that if you're into maths and you're into stats, you get drawn into cricket a bit more than the other sports because the stats have been there for many years. I know that there's a lot of data that goes into the football codes now. So if you're a sports fan and a geek, AFL in particular does have a lot of stats into why do teams win games, what are the aspects of the games that they're winning that are more relevant to get you points on the scoreboard. But cricket probably has been the sport in Australia that's had that attraction for the nerds, from the word go. So maybe that's why I particularly love cricket. But at times I've gotten into baseball and followed that a little bit. I don't at the moment, but that's a sport which again has that's nerd central for sports in the US with and maybe interestingly comparing baseball and cricket, which I do in one of the book chapters, that for the purest statisticians, baseball's a better sport because it's each play is much more comparable to each other play. In other words, the fielding positions are always the same. There's no pitch involvement. So it's just a matter of, this pitcher against this batter. You can say, what's the chances that batter's going to get a hit? And there's not that many variables coming in. So it can be, once you have run something 30 times, you can sort of say, yeah, this batter will get 6 hits out of 30 at bats for that pitcher, and that's the expected number, and it shouldn't vary too much. Whereas cricket does confound the statisticians a bit more, but for those of us who are biased and think it's a better sport because of those variables in terms of the environmental conditions that come into it in cricket a bit more. So it's almost impossible. We've just obviously had 2 test series, in one that's still going between England and India in the men's, and one that Australia's just played in the West Indies. And you just cannot compare the stats in the slightest, in that it's an absolute batting paradise over in England at the moment. So the batters are filling their boots, and they look like they've got 6 Don Bradmans in the lineup with the amount of runs that they're getting at the English team, and then hardly anyone could stay in for longer than a few overs in the West Indies. So it sort of was an absolute bowling paradise, and the bowlers look like they're all-time greats because of the conditions. How you handle that as a statistician, and how you get enough data to make decisions on who's in form and who's out of form when the bias varies so much. And even in the West Indies, it's hilarious that Test series last innings we bowled the West Indies out for 27, and then they're suddenly batting decks for the T20 series, and both teams are getting 200 every time they sort of walk out. So it's the that non-accountable element that you can't, we can't really put our finger on and say, oh, this is exactly how the pitch is behaving. We've got a metric for that. That's still very subjective. That one does confound the statisticians a bit in cricket, and but it also makes the sport a bit more fascinating to watch, because there's nothing like that in baseball. So it's that hopefully gives a bit of the passion for cricket, that from my perspective. And whereas 98% of people who are cricket fans probably start there because they or who are hardcore cricket fans because they played it and loved it, and for me it's the nerdiness of the game.
Oh, I love that so much. That is very cool. Your first experience at a live test match, 1981, I think it was, Australia versus England, Alan Border, Jeff Thompson, heroic last wicket stand. Tell us your reflections on being there as a youngster, and did that help ignite your passion for the game?
Yeah, I certainly can remember the centenary test in 77. So I'm, desperately looking forward to that game that we've now got in the calendar at the MCG in 2027, which is only now a bit over 18 months away, which is very exciting to think that we're going to be given that treat, because it's like Halley's Comet coming back twice in your lifetime. So in 1977, I don't think I actually went along to that game, because I was lucky enough that my parents put me down for MCG membership, and I'm still a member, but my parents weren't members, so I was not going along to the members as a kid. But I remember watching that game and being at school and hearing how it was going, because some of the days were on the weekend. So that's an earliest memory of hearing the results of a cricket game and listening to it on the radio and watching a little bit on TV. I saw that game in 1981 was the first one where, as a kid, I just went down there by myself. So I went down there without any family members. And the reason for going down was because it was the last day of a test match, Australia-England in the Ashes. And Australia were trying to get about 70 runs with only one wicket in hand. And it was Alan Border batting with Jeff Thompson. And the game could have lasted one ball. So basically the MCG said it's going to be free entry or gold coin entry or something like that, because we can't charge anyone for turning up when the game might go for one ball, but just come down if you want to watch a bit of cricket. And it could be a minute of cricket, or it could be, it could be an hour and a bit. But everyone knew that if they were going to get up, they had to break the 10th wicket partnership record to win the game. And it was a fairly low scoring game where both teams had only made in the 200s for their innings. So it was expected that Australia had hardly any chance, but mathematically there was a chance. So, and that was an opportunity that I took, that I was in about year 11 and was old enough that I could just go and do my own thing. Kids probably had a bit more leeway in those days growing up, where I do remember getting on the bus to get home from school, and bus plus walk home when I was in year 5, and I was quite young in year 5. I was 9 years old, and we don't do that to kids anymore, but or at least not in the big cities. But yeah, jumped on the train, went down to the MCG and just walked into the ground, not being a member, but not having to pay anything to get in there, sat down and watched that. And it was turned out to be one of the all-time great finishes, in that Australia got within 3 runs with farming the strike, that Border was trying to shield Thompson from the strike, and he was just blocking out a ball or two at the end of the over, and then the strike would rotate. So learn a bit about protecting the tail enders. And then the final wicket was actually a drop catch, that the first slip dropped the catch and it bobbled up in the air, and the second slip took it, and England won the test by 3 runs. So it was super exciting. It wasn't the result that you wanted as an Australian, but it was one of those, I suppose, to invert the talking of the current English term, it was a bit of a moral victory for Australia that they got so close. They had no chance, and they almost got up. I did remember hanging around with an autograph book after the game and getting Jeff Lawson's signature after the game, and hanging around the ground for an hour and a bit, where everyone was just, the whole ground was buzzing because of what they just witnessed in terms of excitement. That probably was imprinted, and maybe in a good way. They say that, you shouldn't go to the casino and win $1,000 on the first time at your casino, because that'll be imprinted on you. But in a good way, The first time I decided to go down to a cricket match by myself just to sort of watch something and see what happened, it was very exciting, and maybe that is why I'm involved in the game at the moment. And but that's probably in a good way. Whereas if I had won 1,000 at the casino and I was a gambling addict, that would have been a bad way. And look, there's a little bit of that too. That I think I did emphasise my nerdiness, but I think that sport is for risk takers, where you're vicariously watching someone else take most of the risk. And if you're someone who, likes the idea of climbing Mount Everest, but you think, no, there's a 1 in 100 chance that you get killed with that, so I don't really want to do that. But if you've got that in you, that adrenaline seeking, but you don't want to sort of subject yourself to it, you can get a bit of that in sport, and it's a very healthy. It's one of the reasons why sport is such a good form of entertainment, that you can get that feeling of the high that a gambler gets when they're spinning the poker machine, which we know is very destructive. You get that feeling of your heart rate going up and thinking, oh my God, I hope that they can pull this victory off or whatever. That sort of happens in sport on a regular basis, and it's in a fashion that you're doing it in a safe environment where you're not putting your own body on the line, but you're relating to the athletes on the field. And so, if you're someone who doesn't like watching things on the edge, then you probably don't like watching sport. But if you know that it's not healthy to do edgy stuff yourself, like climbing Mount Everest and maybe dying of lack of oxygen, but you sort of have that part of you that wouldn't mind being involved, then watching professional sport and working in professional sport is something that might suit you. And so yeah, there's all of that. And then I suppose a related question, once you've got into medicine like I have, and you're a doctor, why would you go and work in sports medicine as opposed to saving lives in the hospital? And it's another really good question. And I think the answer to that is that I really did love sport growing up, being a real fan of it. Fell into sports medicine a bit by default, that I didn't have a good time in medicine in the hospitals when I was finishing med school and early years, just starting off being a doctor. I found the hospital culture to be particularly something that didn't suit me at that time in life, and I questioned whether I'd made the right career decision, and even thought maybe I need to get out and do something else. I was into computer programming, and maybe I would have earned a lot more money if I went into IT in that era in the 1980s and became an expert in computer programming at that time in life. But yeah, I was questioning what I was going to do, and happened to set up an elective in sports medicine in Melbourne with a doctor who's still around, Peter Larkins. He was in practice in sports medicine. I did 2 weeks with him. I went to the States had to do 10 weeks of medical elective, and had a great time in the US in radiology and endocrinology, and came back and did 2 weeks with Peter Larkins as sort of a fill-in, just sitting in with him at his practice, and he started working in sports medicine practice. And it just hit me when I did that I really was struggling with what was going on in the hospitals and not really liking it. And I thought, I like this, seeing athletes and trying to help them get back on the field. And there's someone who's doing this. It's a real thing. And the old thing, you can't be what you can't see, just needed to see that was a possibility. And then I thought, this is the area I'm going to get into, because I like sport and I have a passion for it. And it looks like it makes sense that there should be doctors helping athletes manage their injuries. And it was very, very embryonic at that stage, but I thought it's got to be a specialty. It's got to be something that can work, and I need to get in and be one of the pioneers. So it was a bit of good luck in that sense. And It is now a fully legitimate field, but it's still a niche field in medicine. I think most of the doctors who are working in the hospitals are not fully across sports medicine as a specialty or what we do. But we suffer a little bit from the same denigration that the coaches get. So I think everyone, as part of their admission that they're paying to get into the ground, or paying their cable TV subscription or whatever, they get to sit back and say, oh, this bloody coach doesn't know what he's doing. I would have moved this player to this spot. And then, if he had done the basic thing that I could see from my lounge room, we would have won this game. And I think that as doctors, we suffer a bit from that, as in, that not only other doctors watching us, but other people saying, whenever a player gets hit in the head, you've got half the population saying, oh my God, there's reckless doctors leading these guys with obvious concussions stay on the field. I can't believe that he's not getting dragged off and getting a test on the sidelines. Look at that cowboy letting him stay on. And then you got the other half of the viewing audience saying, oh my God, can these doctors get off the bloody field? I mean, what? No, the guy's fine. Like, let him bat. Like, please. What are they doing? Just wasting this time doing a bloody check. I mean, they're just holding some fingers up. Like, this is unnecessary. It's ruining the game. And I think if you're a doctor getting criticised on both flanks, you're probably in the middle ground, doing the right job. As in, if you've got some people thinking that you're reckless and others thinking that you're, holding the game up by checking the players too carefully, and you're getting criticised by the opposite ends, then you're probably in the middle ground where you need to be in terms of respecting the injuries, but also not getting in the way of disrupting the entertainment. So it's a job that's like coaching, in that, yes, you could get someone from the lounge room to coach the Australian cricket team. They wouldn't do as good a job over time as the actual coaches would do, but they could do it for 2 hours. And the fact that they could, and they might even make the same decisions as the actual coaches for 2 hours, makes everyone think it's an easy job. But it's not an easy job when you're under that much scrutiny, and you've got to be able to make decisions and try to not stuff them up, and to do it knowing that you're getting critiqued every sort of minute of the day. So it's got its own unique challenges working in professional sport, and eventually most people in professional sport end up getting punted, and they renew and refresh teams over time. So again, it's living that roller coaster of thinking, I hope I have a job in 2 years' time. Most doctors don't have to deal with that when they're working in a regular clinic. They don't tend to get sacked from their clinic, but that can happen to you in professional sport too. So we're living a life that's sort of halfway between what other doctors do in terms of medical, ordering scans, looking at the results, discussing with the player, who's the patient, what the results mean and what the implications are for whether they're going to get up and be fit for the next game, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're living the life of anyone involved in professional sport, where you're a bit of an adrenaline junkie, hoping that your team wins enough games that people can keep their jobs, and that we're taking gambles too, that someone with a little bit of a niggle will let them play a test match, and we think, oh my God, if they break down after 6 overs, it's going to look horrendous. And the fingers will all be pointed back at the doctor and the physio. What the hell did you let this player play this game for? So we're partners in trying to get results, and we're accountable for, not as accountable as the players and the coaching staff are for results, but we're a little bit accountable for results. And they're also, as doctors and physios, we're accountable for when things go wrong. If you lose a match because a player took an injury in and it broke down early, and the team had to play one short for most of the match, we're accountable for that. So it sounds like it's the dream job, and in some ways it is. If you love sport, it is a dream job, but it's also it's nice, actually. I don't work in the AFL at the moment. It's nice to go along, and I went down to with some mates to watch Hawthorn play Port Adelaide in Launceston a few weeks ago. It's nice to actually sit in the stands and just be a fan and watch some sport, and just be able to have a beer in the game and sit there and enjoy being a fan. Whereas you have this going to work, when you're working at a game, you can enjoy watching it, but you've got that constant feeling of edginess of, if something happens, I'm in the game. Like, I'm not in the game most of the time, but if you're the doctor on the sidelines, player gets hit in the helmet, you're running out there. So when we turn up to doctors and physios, when we're working at, say, the Big Bash or a night game, you come home and you have the same experience as the players, where you arrive home and it's midnight, you get home and you can't get to sleep until sort of 1:30 in the morning, because your heart rate's just still at 130, and it's very hard to calm down because you just have spent so many hours sitting in there. And it is a different feeling that when you go as a fan and watch a game, you leave, jump on the public transport or jump in your car, and you go home and you're actually really relaxed, and you've just had a great night out watching sport, and jump into bed and you fall asleep in 2 minutes because you've just been able to sort of get rid of your own anxieties and watch other people have anxiety playing the game for a few hours, and that's done its job for you as a fan, that you can arrive home in a real sense of relaxation, saying, I had a great night out, I wasn't accountable, I wasn't responsible, I just got to watch other people slug it out, and then now I'm chilled and I'm relaxed. But if you've actually been part of the staff, and it's obviously worse for the players themselves, you come home from a game and you're just still like pumping, because it's just like, all right, it all got away with another one where no disasters happened today. But the fact that there could have been a disaster, I'm still a little bit on edge, because it's a big public event where the world is watching you, and I don't think that ever wears off. And if it does, it's probably time that you need to quit and retire if you're not paying attention or not caring or not at the ready. You're not performing as a player or ready to perform as a staff member. So it's a fascinating life, and very pleased with my career choice. But you find out once you're in it whether or not it suits your personality. And I think for me, it has suited my personality. So I've been really pleased at choosing to go into sports medicine. But I certainly get that if you were someone who was a little bit more introverted and private, and you should be working in radiology, where you can sit in a room in front of MRI scans where you're not face to face with people. That, again, these are stereotypes, but we've definitely got some radiologists who work in cricket who are big cricket fans, who love doing the scans on the players because they like getting out and watching the game. But again, that's a stereotype that you need to be an introvert, or it suits being an introvert working in the lab areas of medicine where you're looking at scans or looking at blood films or whatever. And you probably have to have a bit of extroversion about you to work in sports medicine and be comfortable with that public scrutiny and interacting with a lot of people in a very public fashion, because if you're not comfortable in those scenarios, then you'll soon get to a point where you're not handling the pressure or not handling the stress.
Yeah. Now, tell us a little bit about your introduction into Test cricket. We had Patrick Farhart on the show a while back, and his call-up came from a guy called Errol Alcott. Well, in the sense that Errol Alcott was on the Ashes tour in 1989, and Patrick was over there playing some league cricket. Errol needed to leave for whatever reason during the tour, and Pat Farhart finds himself in the Australian tracksuit attending to the players on that 1989 Ashes tour. You are working in a practice in Sydney. Australia are playing the West Indies 1996. Big series. It's labelled as the decider. Mark Taylor and Courtney Walsh on the posters. Interested to see how young Matthew Elliott's going to go. He's playing probably his second or third test match. He debuted in Brisbane that summer. He has a collision with Mark Waugh. You're just going about your business. Tell us about how you get involved in that.
Yeah, well, no, it's a really interesting story, that one. And it's long enough in the distance that it's not embarrassing people too much to relate it. I certainly, at that point, I had met Pat Farhart and just run into him because I was working as the Swans doctor in that era. And so the Swans and the New South Wales cricket team would occasionally bump into each other at training in the shoulder season. So just in the lead up to, when the football season was drawing to the close, cricketers would be in pre-season training and jumping on the SCG. So we'd say hi to them. So I had met Pat Farhart before, so he knew who I was, and he might have got me to look at one or two of the players and had been interested at that stage. I think, gee, the Swans, have a doctor down at training. That's really interesting. We don't ever see doctors in cricket in that era. But yeah, in that era, the administrator, like, it's much more of an amateur sport, and the administrators thought, well, we don't need doctors that much, and we'll have a doctor in an honorary position, and the doctor can, we just say to someone, oh, you can be the doctor for the test match. Given that we don't expect you to do any work, we're not going to pay you. And but we'll say we've got a doctor at the ground here, and we'll pay the doctor in kind. They can come up to the boardroom and just sort of sit up and hobnob with the board members. And we've got a doctor at the ground, and they're, we, since we're not paying them any money, they can come up and chat to a few of the board members, and that was the arrangement back in those days. The incident which I do mention in this book, and it is a good story, is so Matt Elliott and Mark Waugh were running a 3 or something like that, and then they were both ball watching at the same time, and they had this massive collision in the middle of the pitch, and Matt Elliott was lying on the ground and couldn't get up and couldn't move. Turned out that he'd ruptured his lateral meniscus, had this sort of cartilage tear in his knee where it's just ripped to shreds and sort of flipped over and locked his knee. So he actually couldn't straighten his knee out. So he had to be taken off. I don't know whether they had a Medicab in those days or whether it was on a stretcher or whatever, but he literally couldn't walk. I brought him into the dressing room, and then people are sort of saying, well, where's Errol Alcott was the physio, and Errol was saying, well, we need a doctor. The medical staff is one person in those days, and he couldn't leave the ground because he had to be there in case someone else. So we thought this player's going to need to go and get some scans or do something at a hospital. I can't leave the ground. So I called the doctor down. Again, I'm lucky I don't know who the name of this doctor was, but doctor had been up in the boardroom. So the board members were all pretty honorary in those days, but they probably had a few bottles of, Chateau Mouton Rothschild being served up in the boardroom or whatever. And Doc had a few of them, come down to the dressing room, and Matt Elliott, who was understandably distressed because he knew he had a bad injury, he basically said, I'm not seeing this, Doc. He's pissed. Like, I can smell the alcohol. He's not looking at my knee. Like, get me another doctor, because someone's got to look at this knee and take me off for a scan because I'm, badly injured, but this doc's not doing it. So Errol was trying to work out what to do and thought, yeah, Pat has mentioned that there's a doc who works for the Swans and his clinic's only about a K down the road. And so he called up the clinic and said, can you get yourself down to the SCG? And as it turned out, I wasn't too busy or whatever, or had one patient coming up and was able to reschedule them. And so I sort of jumped in the car, drove straight down, had a look, examined the knee, said, yeah, this is looks like cartilage tear or something similar, and we need to take you off for a scan, and called up one of the scanners, I think at Edgecliff, and said, we'll take you around for a scan. So I did all the usual professional things, and player was obviously devastated. He was out for the rest of the series and had to have surgery. Went back to Melbourne, had his surgery down in Melbourne. The level of professionalism that I was accidentally, in the right spot and able to offer, that really changed things. So in a good way, you have a disaster like that, and it makes the ACB, to their credit, even though they didn't mind drinking alcohol in the boardroom, they thought, okay, we now appreciate that this isn't good enough and we need to have paid doctors at a test match sort of event. And they reasonably quickly expanded that down to domestic cricket as well, where they thought, this is a public sport and we can't have, with all the football codes having doctors on the sidelines, we can't have a major injury like this. That story never actually got out, but it was enough that they thought, yeah, we've got enough money here that we can pay to have a doctor at the ground who's then expected to not be up in the boardroom having a drink, who's expected to be attentive and ready to move. And that particular incident did change the course of professionalism with regard to medical staff, in that it was a clear an obvious need to have more professionalism in the medical setup, and that led to the states getting doctors, and it all cascaded from there. So it was an interesting incident to be part of, and obviously quite a funny story. Might not be as funny. It would be fun. It would be interesting to get Matt Elliott's views on the situation a few years later. He probably would have a laugh now, but he'd say it's 100% true. I did not let that doctor touch me, but they found another one that was at least able to give me the service that I needed at the time. But it would have been quite distressing for him.
So that's your first taste of being a doctor at the cricket.
At a cricket game,
yeah. So you've done other things as well in sport.
Yeah, so I was working with the Swans. Yeah.
The Roosters, State of Origin Rugby League. There's a famous incident there. Hello, Michael DeVere, if you're watching. Tell us, when did your full-time entry into cricket come? Was it something, as a cricket fan, you're thinking, gee, I wouldn't mind doing a bit more of this? How does it happen?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, in that once you work in sports medicine, you become less of a fan and more of a professional. And one advantage of being in the medical team, so if you're a physio or a doctor, you can shift from sport to sport. So obviously it's hard for players, can shift from country to country, so they can go and play in India in the IPL, or they can go and play in the Caribbean Premier League. But you've got the advantage of the physio is a little bit more typecast, in that the ones who work in cricket tend to be a bit cricket specialised, but some of the S&Cs go from AFL or NRL into cricket and vice versa. So yeah, you grow up as a fan thinking, I'd love to work for the team that I grew up supporting in the football codes or whatever, and then you quickly realise that maybe that's actually not a good thing to work for a team that you support, because you lose your objectivity, and that it's not a bad thing for you that you do move around. So I have had fairly lengthy gigs with the teams that I've worked for, but you do get moved on, and you need to be prepared to move, because you're a professional, and it might work both ways. Sometimes you'll elect to move and go somewhere else, and sometimes you'll get punted by a team. And so for me, moving to Sydney, as someone who grew up in Melbourne, I spent a year at the AIS in 1993, which was fantastic for my career. And then I was looking for an AFL job back in Melbourne, and was offered a couple of reserve grade jobs, assistant doctor jobs. And someone said you should give the Swans a call. Their medical is very unprofessional. That was when they were at their really lowest ebb in 1993, and they'd won the Wooden Spoon 2 or 3 years in a row. And they said, someone like you who's young, who's going to work hard from an AFL state, they might take you on. And they did. So I moved to Sydney to look after a team. So I didn't know anyone in Sydney, just moved up there to get a job. And then I did get lasted 4 years at the Swans, and then they let me go at the end of 97. So that was a decision that was not of my making. But then I got a job with the Roosters the year afterwards in 1998. Had 7 years with New South Wales State of Origin between 2000 and 2006, which was good fun as well. And I got let go from that job in 2006, and managed to have 4 or 5 years where I was working for the Roosters in winter and the New South Wales cricket team in summer. And that was a really busy time in my life, because then there was no off season for me. So in the end, it was sort of lucky that finished up, because I think I would have got burnt out at that pace of having such a hectic schedule, but was mixing those two together for a while, and left the Roosters at the end of 2013. And that was my decision at the time, but that wasn't a fun part of my career that year, even though the Roosters did win the comp. But we were going through the Stephen Dank era in the football codes, and it was becoming a little bit hard to work as a doc in the football codes in that particular year for that reason. And then had a year where I was just doing New South Wales cricket, and then the job as the Chief Medical Officer for Cricket Australia came up. So I had a quiet year where I wasn't working as much as I would have liked with elite sport, but then got offered the job as the Chief Medical Officer. And so since 2014, I've been Chief Medical Officer for Cricket Australia, and effectively the same for Cricket New South Wales. Cricket is about 75-80% of my work. So I do a little bit of work at the clinic on the side, and most of the doctors, there's not too many full-time doctors working in Australia. Some of the docs at the AIS are full-time, and Chief Medical Officer for the AFL is definitely full-time. But most of the doctors, even if they're working substantially in a sport, do go to a clinic and do a day a week just to keep their hand in. Partly to have a bit of a base to go back to if you do lose your job with the sporting organisation, and partly also because you're seeing a few more, if you're actually working, like my cricket job is definitely Chief Medical Officer with Cricket Australia, is very administrative and management orientated. So I do see some of the players and will help out in some of the case management, but there's a team doctor for the men's team and a team doctor for the women's team. So as Cricket Australia Chief Medical Officer, I'm not seeing that many cases. So going to the clinic and doing a little bit of time at the clinic during the week is a way that I'm actually still seeing sports medicine cases in the real world, so that I'm not completely rusty. Because I think if you become a full-time manager where you didn't actually see much. In fact, my counterpart in the ECB, Nick Pearce, I think he is full-time with the ECB, and therefore is very much a senior manager rather than I mean, he's certainly medically trained, and he's done many years touring with the England cricket team, so he's very experienced, but he's not on the tools, so to speak, as much anymore. So and I'm a bit half now. So I do see cases, and I'm still looking after people making decisions on individual patients and individual players. But But then half of it is what we call administrative management type work, where you're setting up structures of how should medical care look across the whole of Australian cricket. And when we have controversial cases, we help sort them out. There's more. You actually, there'd be 20 doctors, 25 doctors who are working in cricket in Australia. Most of them fairly part-time, but there's a lot of doctors who you're overseeing and making sure they're fitting into the system well, and that we're providing a good level of coverage, or the appropriate level of coverage across the whole spectrum. So cricket's a big sport. There are some sports in Australia that have got a nominal chief medical officer, but the medical coverage for that sport's very low because they're a low profile sport. But the football codes are now super highly covered. So AFL games and NRL games, you'd have 2 doctors for each team on the sidelines, and then 1 independent doctor, maybe on the sidelines or maybe in a bunker, looking for concussion cases. So minimum of 5 or 6 doctors at a top level football game in Australia at the moment. And cricket, we generally still work with 1 doctor covering both teams at domestic level, or 1 doctor covering the Australian team at international level. So our medical coverage is a lot thinner than the football codes, but it's obviously still higher than some of the Olympic sports, where they will have a doctor with them for the Olympics and some other tours, but other games they might play at home, they might not have a doctor there. They might have a physio there if they're a low profile sport, because they can't afford to have a doctor at every game. So the coverage for each game, and cricket quickly drops off into amateurism, in that first grade at Premier Cricket doesn't have a doctor or physio. Players look after themselves. You do a hammy playing first grade, you're basically sort of managing your own injury, which first grade at the first amateur level in the football codes probably have a physio at the game and maybe a doctor in Australia at the moment. But every sport quickly drops off to a level where players do have to look after themselves, and setting up how do we get involved in challenges like what level of coverage of defibrillators can we help set up at amateur matches around Australia, because that's still a very relevant question. You'd like to think in this day and age that if you're at a sporting event and someone has a heart attack, whether it's a player or an official or a crowd member, that someone's there with a defib and can zap someone back into life. But if you don't have any paid medical staff there, how do you set it up that someone knows where the defib is and can use it and save someone's life before an ambulance gets there? These are challenges that we look at from a management administrative point of view. And one downside of watching professional sport is that there's some people think that there's a doctor or a physio at every game that gets played in Australia, and that's not the case at all. It's like the top 0.3% of games have medical staff there, and most games that get played in Australia of most sports like cricket, there's no one on a medical basis at the ground, and players have to look after themselves. There might be a team manager who helps out, and that's about it. So these are interesting challenges, because we want everyone to have access to good medical care in Australia, and compared to other countries, we do. Like the public hospital Medicare setup that we've got in Australia is very good on a world standard. But it's always a challenge to think you want every sport to be safe to play, and you want every sport to have people be able to get their injuries and illnesses associated with the sport looked after.
And you've done a lot of research in the background as well over the years. Lots of that coming through in this book. I've had the privilege of reading four chapters as a bit of a pre-read, and one of the things I was really fascinated around was you reference what you're calling a paradigm shift in the way that injuries are treated. You reference Dr. Hoy, I think it was, who was a Victorian state doctor, and then Dr. Trevor James, who came after that in the early stages of managing injuries in the Australian cricket team. And then the Argus Review 2010 leading to, and the emergence of Patrick Cummins, who, I don't know how many overs it was he bowled in that Shield final, maybe 65 overs or something like that. A young guy coming in to the scene, playing a test match. And then you're involved. You're involved with the big four. And you compare those guys with, and this is a good reason to get the book, everyone, by the way. You reference this to people like Michael Neeser, whose father had a bit of a background in managing injuries and that kind of thing, encouraging him to bowl off spin and concentrate on batting. James Pattinson, who was probably the other way, who just got the best out of himself for as long as he could until his body couldn't do it anymore. Tell us about what it's like having to monumentally shift the dial. This is how we used to do it. This is how we're going to try and do it in the future. How do you do that?
Yeah, look, that's the an unwritten story. Now it is written in this textbook, and this textbook, by the way, for it is very nerdy. It's the will be of some interest to the lay people, but that chapter will be of interest hopefully. But the target audience will be physios, doctors, S&Cs, people who work in professional cricket or related sports. But yeah, that particular story is our most interesting story in cricket, and in Australia we've led it, where all cricket's a skill-based sport. So all of the culture's based on the 10,000 hours principle, where you just have to go, and if you're a batter, you face not 10,000, you face 1,000,000 balls, and as a bowler, you bowl 1,000,000 balls, and it's just skill repetition, skill repetition, skill repetition. It's about like, Tiger Woods hit more golf balls than anyone, so he became the best golfer. That's the culture on which becoming an elite cricketer is based, both at the batting and the bowling end. But the bowlers, inevitably, with that traditional culture, they all destroyed their backs anatomically at a very early age. So they got multiple stress fractures. The stress fractures didn't heal. And part of the culture was, as a bowler, you just have to be tough. You have to sort of have 6 cement pills for breakfast every day. Your back will be hurting every day, and you get up and you play with the pain. And you've bowled all those deliveries, so you're good, and then you're just living with chronic back pain, and you're tough enough. All the other bowlers are living with chronic back pain, so you just have to be more skilled than them and tougher than them and get out and do your job. And that was how fast bowlers, that was their culture. That's what they did. And there were the physios who were more involved than the doctors started to question that, to say, well, can we stop them getting unhealed stress fractures, so that because they really all had bad backs in the 90s. And the first few cases where physios were starting to intervene and say, maybe we can do this a bit differently. The 2 pivotal cases in Australia were Brett Lee and Mitchell Johnson, who both missed substantial amount of time when they were younger, and the doctors and physios advising them on that, and that followed through on saying, look, maybe we've got to get this stress fracture healed rather than rush you back to play. We hit the jackpot with those 2, because those 2 were players who ended up having very lengthy careers where they maintained their pace over their careers. So your traditional fast bowler was a tearaway in their youth, and then they became wily and clever when they were in their late 20s, and just putting the ball in the right areas, but they couldn't bowl nearly as fast because their back was so stiff they just couldn't generate any rotation anymore. But then you had cases of, well, maybe if you get the stress fracture to heal and have a player out for a season to get it to heal, then maybe they don't end up like that. And then you had a couple of cases like Brett Lee and Mitchell Johnson where it worked. And then this pivotal change was Cummins, Hazelwood and Stark all got contracted to Cricket Australia, and we haven't really done it since. In that, and someone I didn't mention in the book, and I just was reminded about it the other day. I think John Inverarity was chairman of selectors in those days, and he came from an AFL background. And I think that they were running the analogy of, on an AFL list, you have your you're trying to win the premiership with this year. You've got a couple of high draft picks that, they're not going to play for you, but you want to sign them up early and have them on your list, because they'll be your best players in 5 years' time. So I think that they were running that mentality with, why don't we just contract Cummins and Stark and Hazelwood as our fast bowling group in the future, and they're just going to be our draft picks that are sitting on our list that aren't expected to win us games, but we'll just sort of have them there that we look after them. And that decision was absolutely monumental from a viewpoint that those players from a very early age were contracted by Cricket Australia, and there was huge criticism in those days, because the senior players would say, why are we paying Pat Cummins $300,000-$400,000 a year to just sit on the sidelines and rehab his stress fractures? He's hardly played. He's played one test and then he's been out injured for 3 years, and we're paying him $400K a year to do nothing. And the doctors and physios just keep diagnosing with stress fractures and he won't get on the park. Like, what a waste of money. Why is he even on the CA contracted list? It's ridiculous. Everyone wanted him to go through the standard pathway where he becomes a New South Wales player and feed him some cement pills, put him out there and see if he can bowl with stress fractures, because, you know, all the other bowlers did it in the past, and that's, you know, Dennis Lilly bowled with stress fractures and Jeff Lawson bowled with stress fractures, etc. And Cricket Australia, and I pay tribute to Ellis, who sadly is finishing up with Cricket Australia very soon, but he was the Australian physio at the time, and he said, We've got these guys contracted, and we are going to follow the pathway, the Brett Lee, Mitchell Johnson pathway. With Stark only have one stress fracture in the lumbar spine, but Hazelwood and Cummins both had multiple. And at all times, they were Australian contracted. At all times, there was a little bit of pressure at the New South Wales level to say, look, just get them back on the park. We need to win the Sheffield Shield. We want these players back. They're very good. Everyone was in unanimous agreement that these guys were very good. So from a talent ID perspective, the New South Wales coaches and the Australian coaches were all on the money in terms of saying these guys have got something very special. They were able to be identified as future internationals. But that final bit of the recipe, which was every time they got a stress fracture, the system led by Alex Contouris as the Australian physio said, we are going to have these stress fractures heal. We're not going to play with them unhealed and prioritise the short term. We're going to prioritise the long term. And, you know, as history can now be written to say, that was an unbelievably good decision. And certainly those three players, particularly Josh and Pat, said Mitchell Stark had a few he had injuries, but he was less focused on the back. He had more ankle and knee injuries. But Josh and Pat went through this phase of, you know, we'd diagnose another stressy, we'll rule them out for another 6 months. They'd be in rehab. They'd be getting criticised for, you know, being a waste of space on the CA contracted list. And then when they finally came good, the number of years that they've been good for, what they're doing in their early and mid is what has never been done before. In terms of the Dennis Lilly type player was a bit washed up at 31, whereas, you know, in some ways, you know, the big three of fast bowlers are keeping that middle generation out of the Australian Test team, and that's a knock-on negative that's a nice to have, in that they're so good for so long, and they're still, you know, they can't be too far away from retiring, but they're still the best bowlers. Like, they're the best bowlers in Australia, the best bowlers in the world. You've got to keep picking them, and everyone, you know, every cricket traditionalist is sort of scratching their head thinking, geez, they're so high performing at ages like 33, 34, 35. We can't believe how long they've gone for, because fast bowlers never really had that longevity. And it now, with the benefit of hindsight, you can come back and say, well, if you throw them in the deep end early as fast bowlers, their backs don't hold up and they won't have a long career, or they will tend to not have a long career. And the new way of doing it, of wrapping them up in cotton wool when they've got stress fractures when they're young, which will happen, which is almost inevitable, and then waiting until their backs are fully matured and they can withstand those loads. It's certainly a shift that is now fully accepted. Whereas we used to have the occasional fight with coaching staff and selectors in the previous eras about management of young fast bowlers, I think that the paradigm shifts across the board now, that all of the coaches think that that's the right way to go, to look after the young fast bowlers. So you can throw the batters into the nets and let them face 1 million deliveries in the nets at the age of 19 and 20. But with fast bowlers, they want to hear about workloads. They want to allow us to do screening scans of lumbar spines on young fast bowlers to make sure they're not developing stress fractures in the background. And that's the way we now manage them in Australia. And I think that the other countries are starting to catch up and think, well, we need to look at what Australia has done, because that cartel of our bowling attack that we've had fairly intact in the last 6 or 7 years, that's looked upon very enviously by the other countries how have Australia managed to do it, because it's particularly for our conditions. Obviously, if you're India, they nurture spinners even more than we do. Mainly, I suppose, by the virtue of the pitches and the climatic conditions that they play in. So every team's going to pick multiple spinners in the one lineup in a red ball game in India, and spinners in Australia and England don't get nearly as much of a chance to show their wares, because there's usually only one in a team, and they'll only bowl big overs if conditions suit. So we're certainly a country that pure pace is at its fore in Australia. In England, you can bowl medium and put the ball in the right areas, and the pitches traditionally do a bit. Although it's fascinating to see that the test pitches at the moment with Bazball, they're laying out absolute batting paradise decks for their test team, but in county cricket they might have it go the other way, where you've got green tops. So the one other thing too that I tossed in one of the chapters, that apart from our brand being pure pace in Australia, and that we're the land of the fast bowler, because we play on Aussie rules grounds in cricket, we're also the country that specialises in fielding the most. So most other countries of the world have smaller grounds, and it's either dot ball, single, or boundary, and that twos and threes are quite rare in other countries of the world. In Australia, we're the land of twos and threes, so it does encourage fielding proficiency, because there are more runs to be saved in the field in Australia. And the batters have got to run. If you score 100 in Australia, you've run a lot more of the 100 than you might have run if you're scoring 100 in the other countries of the world, where you would have had a higher percentage of boundaries. So that is part of our branding as well, that we are a fit team that is very athletic in the field, because that's an advantage we get playing on these large size grounds, and the grounds have just evolved to be large because of that. That sort of randomness that Aussie rules was developed as a sport to keep the cricketers fit in the winter, allegedly. But they've got 18 on the playing field. Why they're 18 on the playing field in an Aussie rules team is a bit like why they're 18 holes at golf. They're 18 holes at golf because that's how many fitted into the paddock at St Andrews in Scotland. So you suddenly have this big sport of massive number of players on the field in Aussie rules, and suddenly cricket grounds in Australia are an enormous size compared to the rest of the world. And then that sort of changes the brand of cricket in Australia, that we win at home because other teams come here and they athletically can't keep up with us, because they're just running so many Ks in the field that they don't do at home. And we maybe the pitch conditions are a little bit different, but the outfield doesn't get as much credit in Australia. That it sort of is our defence, that we just run the opposition into the ground, whether it's men's or women's. We just they cannot keep up athletically with playing on much bigger grounds. Why do we have much bigger grounds? Because we've got this weird football code that gets played in the opposite season to the cricket games. That makes our grounds stay really large. So it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating book. I'd really like to know what are your hopes? What are your hopes? What's the if the book achieved a level of success, what is the level of success for you as one of the people that are contributing to it?
Yeah, look, it won't achieve mainstream success. It's a niche market, because there's a lot of chapters that are on managing elbow injuries, managing knee injuries, and again, physios will be interested. Someone who's had a lot of injuries, who's a cricketer, might be interested in buying a book. But it's a university library type book. It's not a mainstream book. So we're not going to sell 10,000 copies. Well, what we want is for it to be the Bible, that if you're a physio who gets a job with a cricket team, you'll get a copy of this book and you'll read it, because it's got some of the authors. Well, many of the authors are the best in the world at what they do. There's a chapter written on surgery for lumbar stress fractures, and we hardly ever operate on them, but where cricketers do get their backs operated on for stress fractures, almost all of them in recent years have gone to a surgeon called Rowan Shelton, who's in Christchurch, New Zealand, who just has become the most renowned surgeon for putting backs back together again if they do need to be surgically fixed. And so he's operated on Jasper Bumrah and Jofra Archer. In Australia, he's operated on Ben Dwarshus, Jason Berendorf, James Pattinson. So, and he's operated on a number of the New Zealand players like Matt Henry is a surgical case of his that's gone very well. So he's written a chapter on surgical repair of lumbar stress fractures, and he's the Don Bradman of lumbar surgeons. You know, he's done more than anyone in the history of the game, and got more people back to playing high level cricket, and some really big names. So if you're ever thinking about getting your back operated on, you want to read about who's the Don Bradman of lumbar spinal surgery, and he's written a chapter. So, you know, like that's the you know, sort of author we've got in the book. Very, very niche and very geeky, but if you've got a particular interest in that area, you want to know who is the gun, who's the number one in that area, and hopefully we've got most of the people from the international community. Most of the people who were invited did write a chapter on an area of their expertise. So it really is a who's who internationally of cricket, sports medicine, and sports science, and who are the doyens and the most renowned people in particular areas writing chapters. So it's for that niche market, you have to have a real interest to want to go and buy a textbook like this, and it will sell for a lot more dollars than a normal book will at Angus and Robinson or again, that's showing my age too. Clinical store, like this is like medical textbooks, like text cricket, you know, Angus and Robertson stores. I mean, there's going to be a whole generation that don't ever read textbooks, that they just watch, and they're not going to listen to podcasts that go for an hour. Like, what are you doing? You need a 10-minute clip. Like, please condense it, Matt. Like, you're a dinosaur having these long discussions with people. What's going on?
That's right. Don't worry. We throw a bit of editing in there, and get the short clips out to our audience as well. But there are the true cricket librarians that will indulge every, which is great.
It's the people who, you know, open the newspaper up in the morning, who watch watch domestic red ball games. Yeah, it's the dinosaur era. You know, like the long format of everything, and obviously we're fighting against that sort of gradual shift towards fast and furious, you know, T20, T10. Unfortunately, my kids don't read newspapers. They sort of, their news is social media based, YouTube based, and that's the world we're evolving to. But it's one of the reasons why the occasional textbook or long read or test cricket game or 4-day golf tournament retains a little bit of mystique, and the Olympics, you know, having a competition every 4 years rather than every sort of 4 months. You know, some of the traditions become even more valuable because they're a link to the past where life was a little bit less rushed, and there's a lot of good things about that we miss. So some of those traditions of longer everything still maintain themselves, which is
absolutely. And now, if we've got time, can I ask you our final question, the most important question that we ask our guests? And being a cricket nerd, I love this. I'm really interested to see where you go with this. If you could have a dream cricket net session, who are you going to invite? They don't have to be cricketers; they could be anyone. Who's on your list? Yeah,
that's a good question, and I've got to say that is it alive or dead? Because it's sort of like, you know, I mean, obviously,
anyone. Past, present, as random as you like.
Well, now that you toss up that it's non-cricketers, one of my most bizarre experiences in cricket was, so I'll tell you a story, and I'll throw in two people, and then I'll throw in a third. But so I was covering a one-day game for Australia in England. It was at Lord's, and David Warner was opening the batting, and he got hit in the thumb, and it was pretty convincingly a broken thumb. So we thought, we're going to have to take him down to a clinic just around the corner in London, get an X-ray, have a look at how bad his thumb is, and basically work out whether he's out for the tour or whether it's a little tiny chip that he's going to be able to play with, or whether it's going to be one that's going to end his tour. And we're in the security manager's car, about to drive around the corner to go to the clinic, and he gets his phone, because he's gone out of PMOA, which is where you're not allowed to have your phones, and he's been given the pass to go and get an X-ray, so he's left the sort of secure section, and then he sort of got a message on his phone, and he said, "Oh, look, can we just pull over here? and just stop. One of my mates is just coming down from the members at Lords. I just want to have a quick word to him before I go off the hospital. The security manager and I are thinking, Dave, what the fuck? Like, you can't get your X-ray. You don't have time to talk to one of your mates. Like, we're taking you to, the game's going on. Like, the physio's covering for me. I'm going down the road. You get the X-ray. There's no doctor for the Australian team. You want to talk to one of your mates. And the mate that came down to chat to him was Mick Jagger. So Mick Jagger just comes down from the... So Dave's just sort of sitting here, and the security manager Frank Damasi and I are just going. Mick Jagger is just outside chatting to Dave Warner while he's asking him about how your thumb, you got time to catch up for a round of golf, and we're just thinking. The funny thing is, you hang around athletes and so famous cricketers don't freak us out at all. So if Brian Lara walked in, we'd sort of go, oh yeah, Brian Lara is another cricketer. Mick Jagger comes down and you're thinking, holy hell, I'm standing next to Mick Jagger. So you've just reminded me about that story, which I hadn't prepared for, and I'll nominate Dave Warner and Mick Jagger as two at my next session. So Mick Jagger, who doesn't know me, would talk to me because I get introduced by Dave Warner. So that's would get me famous. And look, I'd have to pick one of the West Indians because the nostalgia bump, where you remember things from your late teens and early 20s and they become the most significant. So I don't know whether I'd take Viv Richards or Michael Holding as my sort of third. If I've got Warner in there, I have to have Michael Holding bowling too. I love him as a commentator, so maybe I'd have Jagger and Warner and Holding as my three. But hopefully that got you one extra good anecdote out of that, which is fascinating. So.
That is outstanding. David Warner just catching up with one of his mates at Lords. How good. Well, thank you so much, John. I've really thoroughly enjoyed listening to your stories, learning more about the book, and wish you all the best with the release of that when it comes around pretty soon. It might already be released by the time that we release this interview as well. So thank you again, and wish you all the best.
Okay, no, thanks for having me on, Matt. It's been lots of fun.